Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our Talks with Walt. We now turn to the little poem at the conclusion of, nearing the conclusion of Inscriptions. This is poem number 21, Shut Not Your Doors. Now, again, out of the concluding poems, this is one of those small poems that's going to tell us a lot about Whitman as person, Whitman as poet. Now there are some assumptions as we are working through each one of the poems of the deathbed edition of Leaves of Grass. My hope is that you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net. If you haven't hit that site, go down that left-hand side, find that list there called Talks with Walt, and begin, I hope, to be able to see some of the earlier stuff. I'm going to make some references to earlier texts that we've already studied. We continue to do that. That is to say, we are always reminding ourselves that we really are the stories that we tell and retell. And this will be significant for this poem. We are the stories we decide to accept, and we're the stories we decide to reject. Now, of course, the rejection of a story is deeply unsettling to someone like Whitman, who is begging for his story, he'll call it his book, to be read. So we're gonna get into that. Our learning theory, just to remind, is our desire to connect new information to old information in meaningful ways. The new, N-E-W, is the new, K-N-E-W. I think that's significant for our study of Leaves of Grass. The ways in which certain poems, like this one, which is not often studied or read, but I think it's really an important poem to reading Leaves of Grass. Our annotative approach is always needing to be reviewed as well. At level 1, what does the text say? At level 2, what does the text mean? Themes, messages, 2A. Of course, the rhetorical techniques at 2B. And then finally, at level 3, how can I relate to this information in some meaningful way at 3A? Other texts, we're going to see this right away, to the old cause is one of the early poems we've already lectured that factors heavily here. And then finally, how can I relate this to myself? Our big 5 is to ask about this text. What does this text say about epistemology, what I know, ontology, who I am, psychology, the study of the individual mind, sociology, study of the group mind. We're going to see a lot about psychology, sociology in this one. And then, of course, the question of theodicy. Why is it that bad things have to happen, and how can I live with those things? Here, the potentiality of rejection is one that Whitman will pronounce, and he had to live with all his life. Speaking of, we will assume some familiarity with Whitman as at least 5 perspectives, all the 5 Ps. Whitman as person, those insecurities, we're going to meet some of those here. Whitman as poet, and the longing to be accepted. Whitman as pedagogue or instructor. Whitman as politician, love of democracy. And finally, Whitman as philosopher, from our Socrates through our Aurelius and the Socratics to finally Emerson himself. Now, just as we've often will do, we're going to just go to the background information for just a moment. Now, this poem was first a drum taps poem, that is to say, over-related to the poems specific to issues of the Civil War. The piece, however, was much improved in revision, achieving its final end, according to Norton's best form in 1881. Inscriptions. Among the changes was the dropping of 4 lines in the 1871 version to become, in 1881, part of another poem as they draw to a close, a poem that we will study later. Now, as we look at this little poem, we're already interested in Whitman as person and Whitman as poet. We're interested in that psychological perspective, that sociological dance, because Whitman wanted his poems and his collection of poems, Leaves of Grass, he calls it his book, to be accepted, to be appreciated. And he's longing for that at the very end of the inscriptions section. Let's read the poem. Shut not your doors. Shut not your doors to me, proud libraries, for that which was lacking on all your well-filled shelves, yet needed most, I bring. Forth from the war emerging a book I have made, the words of my book, nothing, the drift of it, everything. A book separate, not linked with the rest, nor felt by the intellect. But you, ye untold latencies, will thrill to every page. Now you could, as Whitman, we've said in earlier lectures, Whitman the great self-promoter, you could read this poem as really an act of advertising for Leaves of Grass. But I think there's other things going on here that we don't want to overlook right away. Notice, shut not your doors is a creative way to say, to those who might reject his poem as his collection of poems, his book as he calls it, as not being legitimate, it's a way to say, give me a chance, right? And let me give you a reason why you should give me a chance. By the way, notice the adjective proud for libraries. In other words, it's possible, he says, you may not accept my poems because they're too low. They don't seem to have the same legitimacy to sit on a shelf next to. And then obviously the list begins, right? We think about the canon of Western literature that we studied so often in 303, beginning obviously with our Homer and our Virgil, and coming right up through, and I think including the writings and the speeches of Emerson. I think Whitman was acutely aware, living in the time that he lived, Emerson, I mean, think about this, Emerson, Hawthorne, Melville, Dickinson, obviously, although Dickinson not so much appreciated until after her life, and we're going to get to Dickinson in a little bit. I think there's a lot of Dickinson in this poem, and we'll see why in a moment. But notice he's just begging, please, give me a chance. Don't shut your doors against me. And then he'll give his reason why. For, he says, because that which was lacking on all your well-filled shelves. By the way, notice that the spelling of the word filled here with well-filled are lighted verbs, as we've said, trying to capture the American vernacular. Yet needed most, I bring. So let's go ahead and say it out loud. This will be the suggestion that of all the books from Homer going forward, there's something missing, and I am going to fill that void. I'm going to take care of it. I will bring my book, my offering. Notice he says, forth from the war emerging a book I have made. Now go back and look at our To Thee, O Cause lecture over that poem. You'll remember his line, my book and the war are one. He saw those two things as symbiotic for really profound ways and reasons. In other words, it almost seems as if he's saying, if you want to understand the war, and by extension, of course, the death of the great President Lincoln, you have to read my poems. I will help you understand. I will help you to be able to comprehend all of the challenges of our nation's history, ongoing political strife. Notice the next line, I have a book I have made. The words of my book, notice the repetition 3 times, he'll call it my book. The words of my book, nothing. The drift of it, everything. By the way, I just want to pause for a moment and notice that the spelling of every and thing it's not the word everything. It's actually everything. I find this amazing that Whitman plays these kinds of games with words. Notice what he says, and here we're back to the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, Coleridge's classic, and our lecture on that, and the whole notion of interpretation or hermeneutics. In other words, look what he says. I'm not interested in the words of my book. That, he says, nothing. And we're thinking, of course, of Shakespeare's Lear. Nothing comes of nothing. The drift of it, everything. Now, this word drift has a very interesting etymological history. It has a maritime history as well. Drift here, of course, meaning. That is to say, he's arguing my book is more than words. Of course, he knew his Hamlet, words, words, words. Remember, Hamlet comes on stage to engage Polonius, reading his little essay of Juvenal to talk about old men crawling backwards like crabs. Words, words, words are all that Hamlet will say about it. He says, I got something way more important than words. I've got the drift. In other words, there's something important here, and I want you to see it. Now, obviously, this poem speaks to us as we are beginning our reading study of all of the poems of Leaves of Grass. To get the drift. And notice, we still use that term sometimes today. I think I get the drift of what you're trying to tell me, right? The implied meanings, the not just denotative understandings, but the connotative understandings. He says, again, for the 3rd time, a book that he qualifies as separate. Now note the irony of this. He wants his book to sit on the shelf, the well-filled shelves of the proud libraries, but at the same time, he wants his book to be understood as somehow separate, somehow different, fundamentally different. Of course, this is the argument that he will make for the exclusivity of America. That notion of America is somehow really, really unique and special in the same way that his book of poetry is unique and special. Of course, there are other books of poetry, he will argue, but mine separate, not linked, again, the elated verb, with the rest not felt by the intellect. Wow. Now, let's pause for a moment and point out what he's saying. My book belongs on a shelf next to the proud library shelves, next to all those other books. But my book isn't just to be felt by the intellect. That is to say, the distinction between head and heart here. Notice he's going to argue there's something powerful about my poetry, something emotive about my poetry. In other words, when you read my stuff, there is something that will reach out and grab you by the throat, and then he finishes, but you, and then he uses the arcane ye of his early Quaker upbringing, untold latencies. Now, these words are so significant in Leaves of Grass. The word separate, so significant. The idea of latencies. We've already talked about this, and we've seen it a number of times. Whitman is philosopher. Whitman is politician. The idea of this urging, this, it's almost like seed germination metaphor that's going on, right? And he says, there's so many untold latencies that will do what? Potentialities that will do what? He uses the word thrill to every page. Thrill to every leaf of grass. You can see here how he's playing that game, right? Thrill. In other words, I want to blow your mind. Give me the chance to blow your mind. That's what he's saying. Give me the chance to blow your mind. Take my book and read it. But notice the poem is written to libraries. Now, I find this fascinating, the way Whitman, by the way, this won't be the last time we see this, where Whitman, playing games like the romantic poets of Byron, Shelley, Keats, playing around with those odes, as we have talked about them elsewhere at learnstrong.net, here he's talking directly to the libraries. This is a poem directly to the proud libraries and, of course, the intellectuals. He obviously gets the intellect in there. The intellectuals that will be of Whitman's day, the ones, the connoisseurs of what's right, what's wrong, what's accepted, what's not accepted. And he says, give me a chance. Now, of course, we'll already jump to 3a for a moment, but this will remind us of Tilly Olson's Silences, that classic statement of why it is the case that so few women are actually read. It wasn't they weren't writing, it's that men, of course, owned the publishing houses and therefore could silence the voices. We're having a very similar kind of conversation here. Whitman was aware, by 1881 for sure, that his poems, his book, as he calls it, had been neglected because of some of the more indecent types of things going on. And he says, I really do hope that you give me some kind of chance. And if you will only read it and get the drift of it, it will thrill you in some powerful way. Well, of course, here at 2a, Themes Messages, here we have the longing for acceptance. Leaves of Grass, he says, is unlike any other book. It is, it's unique, right? It's exclusively unique. Notice at 2b, we do have the repetition of my book, my book, my book, to just kind of emphasize, look, you got to give me a chance here. At 3a, well, there's so many ways for us to think about how we can relate this. Think about Milton in his opening lines of Paradise Lost as we've lectured them. He says he wants to attempt things unattempted yet in prose and rhyme. I'm going to do something never been done before. Whitman, of course, in a very similar line. But I want us to study for a moment Emily Dickinson's little classic, This Is My Letter to the World That Never Wrote to Me. You'll remember that at the very end of that poem, she says, judge tenderly of me. Please give me a chance. Go back and look at our comments on that poem at learnstrong.net and then compare that one to this poem. It's quite remarkable that these two brilliant poets living at the same time will have a similar kind of longing for acceptance, longing for an ear. Give me your ear, right? Will be the famous lines. Finally, at 3b, well, how again are we going to relate a poem like this to ourselves? I mean, obviously, we've probably been in situations where we were longing for some kind of acceptance. When did that happen for you? But I'm more interested in this question. What book for you is most precious, and why? We'll remember in our study of Yeats' Sailing to Byzantium, caught in that central music hall neglect, monuments, he calls them monuments of unaging intellect. What are those books that for you are a monument of an aging intellect? I guess another way to ask this is, has any book ever made you thrill? And if so, why? Remember what we say about Coleridge and the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. At the conclusion of the story, the old man tells to the young kid, three things happen, remember? A, he doesn't go to the party, he goes home. B, he goes to sleep and wakes up in the morning sadder And then finally C, he wakes up wiser. To what degree can he hear some stupid story about a bird that gets jacked and it changes his life? That identification with the text, that's what Whitman is hoping, that maybe Leaves of Grass will become for you. I hope through our study, especially after we leave Inscriptions, that this is a book of poems that will thrill you. Thank you.